mentioned before, I picked this album and this group because I don't think when Josh and I talked about this earlier before we started, really, that there's not as much Motown on here on this list, the top 100 list that we're going by from best ever albums. So I thought initially, let's go with some Motown, and the Supremes, as I was looking, was one of the first bands that kind of came up, and they're not on the list at all. And so I went with their highest ranked album, which was 1964's Where Did Our Love Go? It actually shows up as number 192 on the best ever albums of the 60s. So this is up there. If we did the top 200, this would have just made it.
And if I am right, Matt,
yeah,
are the Supremes the highest selling act of the 60s?
I don't know that for sure, but they are. They could be, because basically they've had 12 number one hits. They did rival the Beatles in terms of overall worldwide popularity for a number of years. I don't know exactly what that's based on. It's just a phrase that I had come across in my research, but they are they're listed as the most commercially successful Motown group, and also America's most successful vocal group.
So
with
if
12 number one singles.
So if they're not, let's just go off the idea that they're one of, and for their first album to not almost make the top 200 is an interesting deal, because certainly their sales far exceeded what the belief on the best ever album countdown.
Yeah. And it got its due. I mean, it was the number 9 album in 1964. But if you look at and this is something I looked at too, if you break down the years, of how many albums from the best ever, the 100 albums of the 60s were from each decade. And John, have you looked at that at all?
I did, and I know that we haven't covered a single original album before 1966. I think this would be the first one.
Yeah,
because the 61 was the
Beatles. The Beatles was in 63.
But is that an original? Because it is, but it isn't. It's mostly covers.
Well, it's not. It's about half covers, but it's. I mean, a lot of albums there did have covers, but you're right. It's not. The overwhelming majority of the albums that we're covering in the top 100 are from 67 to 69.
Right. I think the earliest one was 65. That Beach Boys Today, if we're counting, or if we're counting the Beatles one, that was 63. Correct.
Yes. Yeah.
And then the Robert Johnson one was technically 61, but I think we all know that that's an outlier.
And apologies to anybody who's a big fan of 1962, but you're not going to see any albums on our list, because there were no albums from 1962 that made the top 100.
It still was a singles landscape. I don't really think it's till the mid 60s that you start seeing albums, and it is the top 100 list is way disproportionate. If you take out jazz, it's almost entirely the back half. I think jazz is about the only thing that saves the top 100 from having any representation. Yeah,
almost 1/3 of the albums were from 69, so it's very top heavy. But this album was, like I said, it was ranked number 9 in 1964, and 2001 overall. I still kind of like looking at the overall. So yeah, you're right, John. For a group that's considered one of the best, all-time selling groups, one of the most popular of the the middle part of the 60s, that's kind of interesting to see that how high it ranks. I guess low it ranks on the overall list. So take that how you will. It was the second album released by the group, I should say, on August 31st, 1964, and 6 of the 12 songs were released as singles. So this, half of this album is just singles, and they really did crank out the tunes. I wasn't really familiar with them at all. An interesting story about this is I was telling my wife, I'm listening. Oh, actually, I started playing the album right off.
So
and my wife
can I just cut in real quick? You were not familiar with, as in what the Supreme singles were?
No. I was familiar with some of the singles, but none of the albums, none
of
the story.
Okay.
So when I picked this record, I didn't know what singles I was going to be getting.
Right. Okay.
So I started playing it, the album. And as soon as it starts, my wife goes, "Oh, is this the Supremes?" I was like, "Yeah, that's pretty good." How'd you know that? She said, "Well, my mom had this record." And then I thought, I took a bunch of records from my mother-in-law, and I might have taken this one. So I went through my record collection, which is not very big. And lo and behold, I had a copy of Where Did Our Love Go that was given to me by my mother-in-law, which I've never, I have records. I don't play them much nowadays, but I do have a copy of this on vinyl. And so I thought it was just by happenstance, right? It happens to be one of the albums that I actually do have. So it was, so you start right off, and there's I think every other song is just a highly, highly recognizable song.
The odd numbers are like one of those diners where you can pick a song for 25 cents. It's basically everything you'd see on one of those diner placards that you could put the quarter in and play. It's single, double side. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was, and actually that's another stat about this album, is that it's the first album that Billboard magazine recognized as having 3 number 1 singles from the same album, which was Where Did Our Love Go, Baby Love, and Come See About Me.
Yep.
So which were the 3, I mean, those ones, if you don't know the songs by the title, which I didn't, I think the only one I knew by title was Baby Love.
Wow.
But as soon as you hear the other ones, though, I'm like, oh, I know this song, right?
If you've listened to if you've watched any movie set in the 60s ever, as well as no shortage of mob movies, you'll basically recognize these songs instantaneously.
Well, what I was reminded of, because the first time right before I played it for my wife, I was out mowing the lawn and I had my headphones in. So I was like, let me listen to this while they mow the lawn. And as soon as it comes on, it's so recognizable, right? Mm-hmm. These songs have just been embedded in my head for the majority of my life. And a reaction I had was, I thought of, for some reason I started thinking of the Wonder Years. And I thought of, like, I could see Kevin Arnold mowing the lawn to a montage of like the Supreme songs. It's just one of those things that you can just see happening in one of those, TV shows or something.
It's interesting that you go there, because mine is every Italian restaurant in Trenton, New Jersey, where I grew up. The Supremes, for whatever reason, and we'll get into this probably a little bit, but they had crossover appeal that other Motown acts did not necessarily have with a larger grouping of Americans. Yep. I think that's why, for me, I enjoy the Supremes, but they don't rank in my top 5 sort of Motown / girl group / doo-wop type groups. And that's not so much a knock on the Supremes so much as just how many great groups there were during this time. But I won't interfere on what you're doing right now, Matt, but that's one thing I do want to mention, that the Supremes had a unique ability to cross over to all culture. And I think that's why what they did too
is they were the ones that really introduced the Motown sound to the masses, so
mm-hmm.
they were that bridge that really were, developed to, be a crossover artist, right? To really appeal to the Black audience and as well as the white audience. And,
especially the white audience, though, from everything I know about the Supremes, right? That was basically that's sort of their calling card.
Well, they doll them up, right? So they put them in dresses and wigs and very intricate makeup, certain choreography with their performances.
And Diana Ross's voice is very velvety and mm-hmm. more Peggy Lee-ish than it is Martha and the Vandellas-ish, I guess would be a way to put it.
It's a poppier kind of thing, and it's not. It's very crisp and clean, So it's
clean would be a great word. Yes.
Yeah. But this album remained on the Billboard Top 100 chart for 89 weeks and ultimately sold over 3 million copies.
Yeah, not surprising.
Yeah, so they were the real deal. So I can go over a little bit of the history. There's a lot of stuff with the Supremes, because as you go through this, here's the other thing too, John. Do you know how many? So the Supremes were basically, from their first album to their last, mm-hmm. Was from 1962 to 1977. If you check out Wikipedia, do you know how many mm-hmm. studio albums were released during that time frame?
I have no idea.
Yeah, 29.
That not including like compilations, or is that including compilations? No,
it's not really compilated, but it's stuff like Christmas albums and covers. Okay. Like the album that came out after this, which was, I think it was, Live from Liverpool or something like that, and the majority of the songs were Beatles covers. So, but they still just pumped out a ridiculous amount of albums,
right.
From that time period.
They almost were a group as long without two of their three original members as they were with them, right? Like I think
Yes.
what weren't Diana Ross and Florence Ballard were both gone for like half of the run, if I remember.
Yeah.
Because there was a period where there were so many documentaries on the Supremes in Motown. I don't know if you remember. I remember. I can vividly remember watching one on the Temptations, on Motown in general, and Berry Gordy, and then there was one on the Supremes.
Right.
And that one focused quite a bit on Florence Ballard, who's a really, from what I remember, tragic figure in all of this. Yeah.
Yes, she was. But she was kind of the starting point. So let's go back to 1959 where Florence Ballard.
Like that softball I served you right there.
That was nice. I was not planned at all. So a young Florence Ballard, I think she was 15 at the time, started the Supremes, who were originally called the Primettes, with Mary Wilson, Diana Ross, who actually her name was Diane Ross. And she went by Diana because there was a misprint on her birth certificate. Yes, they went from Diane to Diana, but and she was Diane Ross for a while, but then she started going by Diana, I think by the mid 60s. So it was Diana Ross, Mary Wilson, Florence Ballard, and another woman, girl, Betty McGlown, who all met. They all were living together in the Brewster Douglas Public Housing Project in Detroit, Michigan. So they came together. They liked to sing. They wanted, and actually Diana Ross used to be in her former house that she lived in. She was neighbors with Smokey Robinson. And so she became friends with him, and he was already kind of establishing himself as, a figure in the Motown scene. And she got him to get them an audition with Berry Gordy at Motown. So they auditioned for Berry Gordy, who was the main guy at Motown. I'm sure you could do a whole documentary on that guy.
3 whole documentaries on him.
So he did like them. He thought they were too young. They were still in high school. So for the next year or so, after school, they would just go down to Motown Records and they would just kind of hang out and pester Berry Gordy a little bit. For some reason, he allowed them to keep coming. Actually, rumors were that there was some sort of affair or flirtation, at least between Diana Ross and Berry Gordy.
At least the biopics they did. Now, keep in mind, some of them were trashy, but they sort of alluded to the fact that they were an item there in the mid 60s. So she was in high school. He kept her away, but it wasn't too far after they got established. And
he was a married guy, so it was definitely, Diana Ross might be the first. She might be the first diva. Time. Yes, it was. Yeah.
Complicated time. Yeah.
So they did work their way into doing. So Gordy finally allowed them to start doing some hand claps and backup singing for other Motown artists, including Marvin Gaye. And finally, Berry Gordy in January of 1961 agreed to sign the group under the condition that they changed their name. So he didn't like the Primettes, and he gave Florence Ballard a number of different options, and she was the one that chose the Supremes.
I'm sure if you were just doing hand claps, you know what I mean, and then they offer you we'll let you record some music if you change your name. I'm sure that was a pretty easy decision right there.
Yeah.
So many hand claps you can do.
They were the Primettes, and then there was also the Primes, who I think eventually became the Temptations.
Yep.
You need to change your name, so they went with Supremes. And initially, they struggled with success for the first couple of years, but that kind of changed when they started collaborating with the writing team of Holland Dozier Holland, who were pretty much. Then they're pretty much all over this album, right? So they were a formidable writing, production trio. Two brothers, Holland. I think it was Brian and I forget the other guy's name, but they basically wrote a lot of the songs that started. Gaining the Supremes' popularity, and all kinds of people popular. I'm a little bit familiar with them as well, and I have not looked at their Wikipedia page or just the bio, but I can only imagine what's on it. In fact, as Matt's going through, I'm half curious to look it up just to see what their response. Yeah, you'll recognize a lot of the people,
okay,
a lot of the artists and stuff, because they had already. It's not like they just started with the Supremes; they had already been working with some other artists. So and up until 1963, the women were all, sharing equal time as lead singer. But in 1963, Gordy chose Ross to be the lead singer. So that kind of went in that direction. They did have a more glamorous image than other black artists, and this was intentional. They wanted them to appeal to both black and white audiences and wanted to, as they say, erase the image of black artists being unrefined or lacking in class. So that was apparently something. Well, I mean, it's early 60s, right? So that's, if you're trying to appeal to white audiences, I can understand why someone would say that this is what, if we're trying to appeal to white audiences, this is what they're going to want, and this is what we should do.
It's funny because that lack of class did not keep plenty of white artists from taking those songs from apparently those classless artists and covering them to death.
Yeah, do you think? Yeah. So you think some white artists didn't have class, John? Is that what you're saying?
I don't necessarily know if they didn't have class so much as it certainly did not keep them from the supposed lack of class of these artists did not keep them from having music that was swallowed up whole by folks later. So obviously the music was able to and as we know, Matt, if we think of rock and roll music, the first thing we think of is class. I know for me, that is what I first think of.
Nothing but, right? Yes. I think that's what they say. Like, class, was it class, soda and rock and roll, right? Isn't that what they say? Something like that.
I think that's what you say, but that's yeah.
And also, I saw that they eventually appeared on Ed Sullivan for 17 different times. I thought that was kind of interesting. That's
wow!
Times to appear on Ed Sullivan. So that's basically leading up. They did lose the fourth member. There were actually two different fourth members, but both of them left at different times before this album came out for essentially the same reason, which was to start a family. They, got married, or one of them, I think, maybe got pregnant. But for the remainder of the tenure of the of the Supremes, no matter who was there, there was always a three vocal group. So let's talk about the album. John, did you know much about this? Because I don't have a ton of information on the album, the production, or the circumstances behind the album itself, other than that it was just the second one that they did. But how familiar with this were you?
I mean, I'm familiar with about 7 to 8 songs right off the first listen of this. Mm-hmm. The tough thing with Motown is the actual studio albums. You kind of are trying to remember which studio album has the hits, kind of like you mentioned before.
Yeah.
So a little bit, I knew it wasn't going to be Stop in the Name of Love, Supremes. Mm-hmm. I knew that was a little later, but I also know that there was a period when the Supremes struggled to make hits. And so is this the album that was the breakthrough for them? Because I remember in one of the movies I watched for a while, it was almost like a running joke around Motown that the Supremes didn't have any hits. And then suddenly they had like a bajillion of them.
Yeah, so, and some of the songs, the three biggest hits were of the six the 6 singles that were released from this album. The 3 number ones were the last 3 to be released. So,
okay,
yeah. So, when I think the first one that they had was the first single was "When the Love Light Starts Shining Through,"
and that was a great song, and you could see why they picked it. Yeah,
and that was released before the album was. That was the earliest one. So that had already been released.
Now.
I'm sorry, that was the second one. The first
I was going to say, can I guess the other two? Because when you were saying that the 3 singles that were the most successful, which is, I'm certain, Where'd Our Love Go, Baby Love, and Come See About Me, because they're the ones that everybody knows, they're pretty clearly, and I would think even in the 60s to me, they stand out as being the clear hits. But you could make an argument for When the Love Light Starts Shining Through His Eyes, and you will hear that song a lot. It's not like it's an obscure song. I am fascinated, though, to think what were the first and the third song picked above those other singles?
Do you want to guess?
Maybe Run, Run, Run?
Yep, that was the third one, released
in
February of 64. Yep, released in February of 64.
Was maybe Standing at the Crossroads of Love?
Nope. No. Although I think any of these could be singles, really. I mean,
they really could. There's a couple that I don't like as much, but there's no. And it's also, they're all out. I think the longest song on the album is 3:04, and then the next longest is like 2:30. So they don't overstay their welcome in least.
Not at all.
I don't know though. What's number one?
The first one was released in June of 63, and that was A Breathtaking Guy.
That makes sense because that does sound like it sounds like the type of singles released in the late 50s, early 60s by white artists. When you think about it, it really does. And when you think about this, it makes even more sense now when I think about that, because that song is by far the song that sounds the most like singles that if you listen to oldies radio, and we're talking oldies radio, we're talking late 50s, early 60s, that was single heavy, sock hop type 60s rock.
Yeah.
I don't even know if you call it pop, I guess would be a better way to put it. So that does make sense, because it probably would be the song that most would sound like something that the artist they were going for would have an awareness of.
Well, and it's interesting too, because that was released in June of '63, which is over a year before before being released on the album. So every one of the singles, except the last two, were released before the album was released.
Okay.
So that's kind of interesting as well. But so those are the singles that they came out with that were actually released, and it was half the album. Half the album were singles.
Yeah, not surprising, because every single, as we said before, they're clean, they're tight. The songwriting trio, I should say, of Holland, Dozier, Holland. If you've listened to the Temptations, if you've listened to the Four Tops, if you've listened to Martha and the Vandellas, you'll notice that sound that permeates through, especially the when you're talking about the non-Phil Spector girl groups and primarily African American groups. That is that Holland, Dozier, and Holland sound.
Yeah.
With the orchestra coming in, almost like orchestral sound coming in, building to a big chorus where the primary singer sings it, and then in the back, the classic on this is, baby, baby, where did our love go? So the first person singing it, and then in the background you hear it at two different tenors behind them. Mm-hmm. And that layering is a staple of pretty much every Holland, Dozier, Holland song.
Well, and that kind of goes into, I came away from this album with two main takeaways. Mm-hmm. The first one is totally about the music. I mean, this is just, it's a great album. It's a super easy listen. It's just, mm-hmm. It makes you smile, right? It's just, and I think I made this comment when we were talking about the Beatles, if you're trying to figure out an album, if you're going across country and you're trying to find something to listen to where it's going to appease multi-generations, this would easily be in there, right? How do you not like this? This is just it's so catchy. And it starts right off with one of my favorite things, which is just hand claps, right? Something so simple, mm-hmm. but hand claps are all over this record. And it always just makes me smile, but it's very catchy. I think that those singles, the three number one singles, are probably the strongest, but I don't think there's a dud on here. And like you said, they're quick and it's not a long album. But I liked a lot of the different instrumentation. There's some I like the baritone sax that's kind of that's in some of the songs, particularly Run, Run, Run. It's a very distinct sound in that song. That's
another huge part of that. If we were talking about some of the hallmarks of different bands that we've talked about and the hallmarks of certain sound, and we could probably have another episode on the Phil Spector element of this, but that sax is a big part of that Holland, Dozier, Holland sound. Hand claps are a big part of it. The layered choruses, a front person singing, even what the songs are about. And they basically, with each artist, they sort of had a prepackaged idea of what they were going to be, right? So the Temptations were a little bit more soulful. The Four Tops were a little bit more lamenting about a painful love that's lost forever. And the Supremes were you always felt like the relationship was still kind of going, right? In a way that sometimes can sound kind of funny in a modern context. With a lot of those girl groups, there's a lot of songs that, I always go back to Your Kiss Was Like a Slap is the one that always comes to me, that I don't think you're putting that one around anymore.
No, well, that goes to my second takeaway, which is actually the lyrical content, mm-hmm. which I didn't get right away. It took several listens, but there was a couple of parts in here where it's easy to pick up, that a lot of the themes in this, it's all about, the main, whoever the protagonist is, right, in the song, whether, he's always lamenting about a lost love or mm-hmm. begging that lost love to come back.
And that's a key, begging them to come back, yes. Not like you've done me wrong so much as, there's your kiss of fire, right?
Right.
Like, I love your sweet, sweet kiss of fire, which sort of is an interesting if you look at it in a postmodern take, not to go too, I don't think our podcast is going to be something where we're going to be talking about like societal norms.
Well, that's kind of what I was, but that's totally what came up in my head, because it's all over the album. And, you know, she's talking about, one of the songs she's saying, you know, everybody's telling me you're bad for me and I know they're right, but I can't not love you. You need to be with me. And even the breakup song
it's men writing songs for women, though.
It is. And it's like, it's just, and I'm sorry, but in the age of Me Too and everything like that, I can't help but think there's no way that, you know, it's not like a Fiona Apple or like an Alanis Morissette or Liz Phair when they break up with a guy. You hear the anger. There's no anger in here. And even when, you know, she's like, oh, we do need to break up. It's kind of like, well, I'm trying, you're not, so I don't think we should waste each other's time. We should just go our separate ways. She's owning it. She's being the mature one and making the decision while the guy. So I don't think that this makes women or men look good in any light.
No, it's definitely something that you notice. It isn't as pronounced with some other girl groups as it is with the Supremes, but it's also a pronounced piece of pop music in that general. And I would argue, particularly white pop music.
Yeah.
Because if you're listening to Aretha Franklin or, you know, Roberta Flack or Nina Simone, these people are not writing songs that are, hey, you know, I'm sorry I screwed up, kind of, and you know, like I really wish they're lamenting lost love, but they are also letting you know that said person is a dog.
Yeah.
And even when you go back to like Papa go later, I should say, to like Papa Was a Rolling Stone by the Temptations, that's a song that definitely is, I wouldn't necessarily call it feminist, but definitely more sympathetic to the mother in that character, right? For basically marrying a dog. And that kind of was, they weren't there yet. You know what I mean?
No, they sure weren't. But when she recognizes him being a dog, she's like, I still love you. Like, you know, your wish is my command type stuff.
But that's something that you'll see in the Ronettes. That's something you'll see in the Shirelles. And what do all those groups have in common, Matt? They were trying to play for like a mixed race audience. And I would go back to when you're talking about groups that were more definitively not crossover. They just made their music and some people liked it. And, you know, we'll cover Nina Simone at one point, but there is a marked difference between the type of breakup, lost love songs that she writes and what's being written in Motown.
Yeah.
And I think because she is a female writing those songs for herself in many cases and working with female songwriters, but also the audience does not expect, and it's a different touch point, you know, but you're 100% right. All of these songs are sort of like, there's this guy and he was great and somehow I can't quite figure out how I screwed up, but I had to.
It's
this
my
guy doesn't
fault.
love you.
Yeah. Oh, it's all over. And I love how they end with Ask Any Girl, which is essentially saying, if you're ever wondering why I'm crying or why I'm such a mess, just ask any other girl. Everybody understands. Everybody's been through this. You know, it's like, it's a universal thing. It's not just for her. This is how women are.
But we could keep going. It's like your Kiss of Fire is basically like, I love you even though, you know, you sometimes can get a little bit out of hand. And Standing at the Crossroads of Love is, you're not willing to commit, but I want you to, but I'll just stand here and kind of let you figure it out.
Yeah.
So,
I know it's a little political, or, you know, but it was worth mentioning because I just was going, man, that's all over the place here. But,
absolutely.
But I thought, no, the music was great. I think my favorite track on here was, Come See About Me. I think that I like the way, I think it's kind of, I sensed a little restraint in the way Diana Ross was singing. You know, it was kind of, she could have gone more all out and she kind of restrained it. And I think that
although Diana Ross doesn't go all out very often. And I would argue that's why the Supremes are not one of my favorite Motown. You know, there's very little Motown that's not, it runs from very good to exceptional, right? But there is a little sameness of it if you listen to, say, 30 songs of it, just because the people writing the songs were in the same orbit, you know, basically. And it kind of, the production was so successful that you could run with it for, I think, I want to say Holland Dozier and Holland wrote from like 1961 to, I know they had a fallout with Motown toward the
Yeah,
end
they
of the
moved
decade.
on, I think, in like 67 or 68 or something like that.
Yeah, it was. I do remember, like I said, there were a lot of documentaries for a while about Motown, and they were brought up prominently. But because that formula was so successful, they could deviate it and bring in different sounds, do 3 pieces and 4 pieces, change the order of the orchestration. But the Supremes, to me, Diana Ross was never a belter. She was a more, as I said before, like velvety voiced singer, and even in the background, it's a deeper, huskier voice behind it. Because if you went higher, right, it would kind of overshadow her a little bit. So it's a different sound pitch altogether. And I go back once again, if you listen to a good contemporary example of them is Martha and the Vandellas, because they go in a different direction. Like it doesn't take long to figure out who Martha Reeves is. She's got a big, bold voice, and behind her, the singers behind her are still going somewhat high notes behind her because she's raising the tenor, right? Diana Ross is, at this point in time, and for most of her career, not going up that scale.
No, right.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think, just a little follow-up with what happens with them. Essentially, Diana Ross, at one point they became Diana Ross and the Supremes, which did not go over well with the other members. John,
that's always a death knell forever.
Yeah.
For every
they
group.
did it because they figured that, Berry Gordy said, hey, if we build this as 2 different acts, like Diana Ross and the Supremes, we can get more money. So that was something that they tried to do.
Weren't they going to spin off the Supremes too, if I remember correctly?
Yeah,
well, they're going to have Diana Ross and the Supremes as separate acts.
Yes, but so that's why when you see their discography, it's some of it. Sometimes it's the Supremes. First, it was the Supremes with Diana Ross, and then it was so it's taken on different incarnations. But eventually, Ross did go solo, and they brought in another artist, but not before. Florence Ballard, or you had mentioned that that she kind of had was a tragic figure, and she had an alcohol problem, and she would come to performances drunk, and she was having trouble performing, and eventually got kicked out. There's
a lot to that, though, in terms of how she was treated, and she's kind of one of the original sad stories of fame and how it can eat you up, and when it's and I think for a while it was sort of portrayed as all of her shortcomings, but she's sort of an amalgamation of all the things that in show business made it very difficult to be in show business, but especially a woman in show business, and especially a Black woman in show business.
I thought she was going to die from like alcoholism or something, but she ended up dying from a blood clot, which she was gaining weight, so I don't know exactly what health issues she was having, but but she definitely she passed away in 1976 at the age of 32. So but in those years, there were a lot of different variations of the Supremes, a lot of different replacements. But they finally broke up in 1977. Although Wilson was the only one that really stayed from the get-go. She was there for the entire run of the Supremes, and they were eventually inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1988. But I did like this story. They tried to do a reunion tour apparently in 2000 called the Return to Love Tour. And so initially it was going to be Diana Ross. I keep wanting to say Nancy Wilson. I know that's not right. Nancy Wilson from Heart. Mary Wilson, sorry. And the woman that replaced Florence Ballard to tour, but the other 2 artists didn't want to do it because they weren't getting as much money. So eventually Diana Ross just toured with 2 other members of that were in the Supremes, but none of them were in the Supremes together at any given time. I
actually remember that happening, and it was not well received.
They quit halfway through because they just weren't selling. So that's too bad. But I really like this album. It's a fun listen. I'm glad I have it on vinyl. I will definitely be going back to it. And I would say probably my favorite track, like I said, is "Come See About Me." And I think I don't know, there was a little bit too much orchestration here and there, but overall I don't think that there was anything in here that I would say I want to skip over that or whatever. That's a dud.
Oh, this is dialed down in orchestration compared to like Four Tops early albums. There's a lot.
And it's not all over the place, but it's there a little bit. I think it was "Ask Any Girl," I think, is probably the one that sticks out the most. That's a little bit too much, but it's still, you're right, it's not ridiculous. So
well, and at the risk of bringing it abruptly to a close. We're going a little long on this album, I think, but I mean, it's Motown, and it's classic Motown. It's a bunch of songs you'll like. It's hard to not like Motown. It's hard to not recommend albums from this. There's a reason they still play these songs, both in restaurants, in movies, on TV shows. They're timeless. And I would say if you like the Supremes album, you should definitely check out Martha and the Vandellas, the Shirelles, the Crystals. There's a ton of Ronettes. There's a ton of Christian Chiffons. There's a ton of great women's groups that all sound a little bit different. Not to mention, Smokey and the Miracles and Four Tops, Temptations. There's so many. Just you plow your way through it, whether it's greatest hits or albums. You can't go wrong either way. So, yep, definite strong recommendation. Glad we were able to touch on this part of the 60s because the singles pop-driven era of the 60s was remarkably underrepresented in the top 100.